It's always great to have the last rock, but it's just as important to have a strategy for fighting back against the other team when you're throwing first, which you'll be forced to do often if your team scores with the hammer. Many new skips feel like it's easier to play without the hammer at first, since the strategies seem so straightforward. Of course, that doesn't mean the results are actually better, and as they get more experienced, those same players sometimes experience frustration at watching stronger opponents regularly get multiple points against them with the last rock. If you're looking to steal more and give up fewer big ends when you don't have the last rock, this is the video for you. Here are my top 5 tips for playing without the hammer. Number 1. Bring the play to the center. This may be the most basic tip ever for playing without hammer, but it's still worth thinking about. Whenever you have the chance to do so, the proper play when throwing first is almost always to bring play as close to the button as possible. This can mean a lot of different things depending on what's happening in the end. On your first rock, you'll either be throwing a center guard or trying to go top 4 on the center line. If the hammer team sets up a deuce by splitting the house, your hits should be aimed at rolling back towards the center, potentially setting up doubles, jams, or places to hide or freeze later in the end. If you're playing behind the tee line, you'll want the rocks to be as close to the button as possible to clamp down on that scoring area. It's easy to get drawn into freezing on a rock behind the tee line on the side of the house, or using a corner guard. But these are almost never the right play until it's very late in the end. Typically during skip rocks, when you have nothing else to use in the house. Until then, always think about how your shots can draw a play back closer to the button, even if the hammer team is successfully bringing the action to the wings. Number 2, you don't have to score. This is something that every skip knows, but often gets lost in the heat of the moment. When you don't have the hammer, you usually won't score, and that's okay. Even at the lowest levels of curling, the hammer team has an advantage, albeit a much smaller one than an elite play. When the other team gets to throw last, you just can't always prevent them from scoring with the hammer. That means realizing that giving up a score of 1 is usually okay, and even allowing a deuce is something that will happen from time to time, and that's fine. On the other hand, if you get hung up on stealing every time you're throwing first, you'll find yourself chasing increasingly unlikely ways to score while letting the hammer team build huge ends. Number 3, be aware of danger. When you don't have the last rock, there's always a heightened danger of giving up a big end. That means you have to be on guard, as a promising looking situation could be flipped on its head in one shot, especially later in the end. For instance, many new skips will overcommit to guarding a single stone in the top 4, even while the hammer team lines up 2, 3, or more stones on the wings. Even if the only way to eliminate your counter is with an angle runback or a perfect downweight hit, people do make those shots. And that means you're now one great shot away from absolute disaster. When you're in a situation where you have to steal, that's a danger you're forced to live with. But on the other hand, when you're ahead or it's early in the game and the situation is still close, it's more important to avoid giving up a big end than get 1 point, which usually means getting a second counter one way or another rather than pushing hard for the steal. Look, a steal of 1 isn't going to win you the game in the first end, but giving up 4 or 5 might lose it for you. Number 4, recognize opportunities to steal. Some of these tips so far might sound pretty conservative, but that's not to say you shouldn't be looking to steal points without the hammer. The key is knowing when you have the opportunity to do so without taking on too much risk. Generally speaking, once you have a foot in about the 4-foot circle and it's guarded, you're in a great position to steal. If you're still looking at that situation when you're throwing on a future shot, it's often correct to throw up a second guard and try to lock down the position, or throw a second counter behind the guard. This will put more pressure on your opponents, and if they ignore your setup, usually by not peeling and instead try and make extremely difficult freezes or draws instead, you may soon be in an absolutely dominant position, where you can try to score 1, 2, or even more without any danger of giving up a big end. If you absolutely need to steal, setting up that center guard early is a must in an effort to get into the situation I just described. However, you might also want to do so if the Hammer team's lead fails to do anything with one of their first 2 rocks. This usually means you'll be in no immediate danger and can freely set up a steal with little danger of a big end from your opponent. So, when don't you have a real opportunity to steal? Well, if you have a guarded rock that's well into the 8 foot or even further out from the center, you might steal, but you shouldn't count on it. Without at least a center guard, the scoring area will be pretty large, and your opponents will have room to draw in for 1 on their final shot. You should either get play back to the center with a guard, or hit potentially dangerous opposing rocks to avoid them moving towards scoring a big end. Finally, you should note there are situations without guards that can also lead to a steal, though they're usually not as promising as what we've been talking about above. Freezing to a rock just behind the pin, especially late in the end, will make it difficult for your opponents to find room to score. You might also be able to steal if you have 2 or more rocks that make it difficult for the opponent to draw in and beat them, and where a hit is unlikely to let them count. Number 5. Use your first rock advantage. Yes, the Hammer team has an undeniable edge overall in any end of curling, but that doesn't mean there aren't advantages that come with throwing first. In chess, the player who's on the attack is said to have the initiative. At the start of the game, that advantage lies with the white pieces since they get to go first. The non-Hammer team can take this same edge in curling, where you will always have the first opportunity to get to any spot you want to on the sheet, forcing the Hammer team to respond. Do you want to steal? Your first shot centerline guard is a threat that the Hammer team usually has to respond to. Do you want to bring play into the house? You'll throw something into the 4 foot, and once again, the Hammer team has to decide how to respond. Until you miss a shot and they don't, you'll consistently go up a rock in terms of the resources that you've deployed, after which the Hammer team gets back to parity by throwing their own rock. In fact, the Hammer team's edge really only comes when they throw the final shot that you can't respond to. In theory, up until that point, the non-Hammer team should be able to dictate the tempo of the end. Of course, a bad miss can flip that initiative, but you'll always have it at the start of the end, at the very least. Use your shots to put pressure on the Hammer team that they have to respond to, whether that's threatening to steal, strengthening an already excellent position, or breaking down their scoring opportunity. You'll constantly be 1 shot ahead, and that's an edge you should exploit to its fullest. There you have it, 5 great tips for playing without the Hammer. Do you have any advice for skips who don't have the last rock? Be sure to leave your own tips in the comments below. If you want to support the channel, you can hit the like button, subscribe to get further updates, or check out my Patreon to unlock even more content. Thanks again for watching, and good curling!